Sio Nagata. Can you hear me? How about now? Yeah. All right. Sio Nagata. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Touton. I'm professor and chair of the Department of American Indian Studies here at the University of Washington. I'm honored tonight to offer an introduction to our UW Alumni Association's Winter 2018 History Lecture Series featured speaker, Dr. Josh Reid. However, as we begin our evening together, I first want to acknowledge that we gather here today at the University of Washington on the traditional homelands of the Duwamish people and in Seattle on the shared waters of the Coast Salish peoples. Born and raised in Washington State, Dr. Josh Reid is a member of the Snohomish tribe and is an associate professor of history and American Indian Studies at the University of Washington. In 2009, he earned his doctorate in history at the University of California, Davis. Yale University Press published his first monograph, The Sea is My Country, The Maritime World of the Macaws, in 2015. The Sea is My Country was published in the Henry Rowe Cloud series on American Indians and Modernity and has received awards and acknowledgments from the Organization for American Historians, American Society for Ethnohistory, the Western History Association, and the North American Society for Oceanic History. Dr. Reid currently directs the university's Center for the Study of Pacific Northwest and edits the Emil and Kathleen Six series on Western history and biography with the University of Washington Press, as well as the Rowe Cloud series on American Indians and Modernity. He serves on the editorial advisory board of the Pacific Northwest Quarterly and is a distinguished speaker for the Western History Association. Dr. Reid's current monograph that he's working on is a project that examines indigenous explorers in the Pacific from the late 18th century to the end of the 19th century. He's also editing a volume of photographs of American Indian activist occupations and a volume about indigenous communities and violence. So you can see he's a busy man. The title of Dr. Reid's talk tonight is The Historical Roots of Indigenous Activism in the Era of Standing Rock. This topic is timely and important not only for indigenous peoples, but for everyone. When indigenous peoples rarely make national news, just consider how prominent and impactful indigenous-led environmental activism has been over the past several years. From protests concerning the tar sands in northern Alberta, to the Idle No More movement, and most recently, No Dapple and Water is Life. Indigenous peoples across North America, and indeed the world, are organizing and actively confronting actions which jeopardize the healthy, sustainable lives of our communities and really of our world. As Dr. Reid will demonstrate tonight, activism is not new to indigenous communities. With his deep knowledge of Pacific Northwest environmental and indigenous history, I can think of no better scholar than Dr. Reid to historicize indigenous activism in the era of Standing Rock, with a focus tonight on Atlantic salmon farming in the Salish Sea. So please give a warm welcome to my colleague and pleased to call my friend, Dr. Josh Reid.
I'll take care of it. Yeah, I'll fix it. Thank you. Okay. You guys can hear me, right? All right. So, Chris, thank you very much for this, for the generous introduction, for coming tonight, especially those students from Nova High School. One of the things that Professor Touton did not mention is that before I went back to school to get my doctorate, I taught middle school here in Seattle for 9 years. And enjoyed it. So it's always great to see where the Academy can reach out and interact with K through 12 students. So welcome tonight. So much like Chris began, I would like to also begin with this acknowledgement that we meet on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish Nation and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastline of the Salish Sea home. For many of you here tonight, this might be the first time that you have heard or thought critically about this acknowledgement. So I would like to take a moment to unpack some of the important words and concepts within it. So let's start with this word, peoples. I use the plural form of this word when discussing indigenous peoples because it highlights the diversity of native North America. Many non-natives mistakenly assume that American Indians or First Nations peoples are all one monolithic culture group. Historic and contemporary. Too often, non-natives are comfortable studying or thinking about indigenous peoples in the safety of the past. They mistakenly assume that native peoples, especially authentic ones, do not exist today. Lands and waters. For many indigenous peoples, especially those in the Pacific Northwest, both land and water are important components of their homes. They derived a rich living from the land, sea, rivers, and lakes. Many still depend on these spaces for their livelihoods today. And nation. This word speaks to the particular relationship that indigenous peoples have with the United States and Canada. These are the tribal nations, or First Nations, that usually have treaty relationships with the larger nation state. But opening with this acknowledgement is about more than passively noting an indigenous presence. It highlights a few themes that I will discuss this evening, particularly those related to tribal sovereignty and indigenous relations to the environment. But more importantly, I consider it an act of dissent itself, a reminder that despite the United States' best efforts to erase Native peoples, we are still here. Best 20 bucks I spent. Now, over a year ago, the world heard a similar dissent from the No DAPL movement at Standing Rock. This emerged from a diverse collection of Native activists in the homelands of the Oceti-Sakowin, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples of the Northern Plains. In April of 2016, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, Standing Rock Sioux, established the Sacred Stone Camp in North Dakota to protect the Minnesota, the Missouri River, from the Dakota Access Pipeline, which carries daily around 500,000 barrels of crude oil south from the Bakken oil fields. At that time, Energy Transfer Partners was working on the pipeline's last stretch, which crossed lands that the Oceti-Sakowin had reserved for themselves in the 1851 and 1868 Fort Laramie treaties. The Army Corps of Engineers had recently rerouted the pipeline away from its original course that had brought it too close to Bismarck, North Dakota. The largely white residents of the state's capital city, population 72,000, complained that leaks jeopardized their water supply. So what we can see here, see that dotted line up there? That was the original route that had been mapped out by the Corps, but after the complaints, and in a breathtaking act of environmental injustice, the Corps ignored the federally mandated consultation process with tribal nations and redirected the pipeline toward the Standing Rock Indian Reservation that straddles North and South Dakota and its 8,000 mostly American Indian residents, of whom 80% are unemployed. And that's the solid line that you see. Over the summer, thousands of people who called themselves water protectors joined the camp and established several more. They were concerned that pipeline leaks will poison the water supply of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation and other communities that rely on the Minnesota. Now, both traditional and social media outlets depicted the water protectors' actions with photographs of peaceful activists chaining themselves to large bulldozers, confronting heavily militarized police, and being blasted by water cannons in the freezing winter months. The water protectors' actions pressured the Army Corps of Engineers to deny the easement for the pipeline to cross the Missouri. But as we know, this victory was temporary. In one of his first actions as the newly sworn-in president, Trump reversed this in an executive memorandum just over a year ago. The Energy Transfer Partners completed the pipeline and began operating it in June. And in the 6 months that it has been in operation, it has already leaked 5 times, confirming what activists and industry insiders alike know: pipelines leak. To many non-natives, the activism of the water protectors was both surprising and unsurprising. On one hand, it was surprising to see indigenous peoples, and so many of them, coming together to protect the Minnesota and the Oceti-Sakowin. Similar to how pundits characterized the Arab Spring uprisings that Professor Bet Shlimon discussed in last week's lecture, news commentators spoke of the No Dapple movement, literally named after a hashtag, as something new that had arisen because of social media. Indigenous activists across the world certainly used social media to show their support for the water protectors. Here we see a group of Maori performing a haka to show support for No Dapple. But the use of new technologies like social media is just part of a long history of how indigenous peoples participate in dissent and support each other. For instance, during the ghost dance movement of the late 19th century, native ghost dances used transportation and communication networks like the railroads, the mail service, and telegraphs to spread this millenarian prophetic practice that sought to wipe away generations of oppression. Similarly, Idle No More activists used new social media technologies to announce round dance flash mob events to draw attention to their dissent against settler colonial oppression and environmental injustice in Canada. Just because the tools are new doesn't mean that the activism and dissent are new. On the other hand, non-natives were not surprised by the iconic images of nonviolent indigenous activists standing in opposition to capitalism and development. And this fit the stereotype of the ecological Indian. Now, most of us in this room will remember this 1970s public service campaign from Keep America Beautiful. In its anti-littering television spot, Iron Eyes Cody literally paddled his way from some antediluvian time into the 1970s present. Here we see him emerging from the past in his horse or in his canoe. Now, there are many problems with these images and the stereotype of the ecological Indian. They present native peoples as being static artifacts. And these images are not so subtly telling viewers that real Indians are a thing of the past. Framed this way, the ecological Indian stereotype dehumanizes native peoples and perpetuates the assumption that authentic Indians do not belong in the modern world. And as several in this room probably know, our time-traveling Indian, Iron Eyes Cody, was no American Indian. He was the son of Sicilian immigrants who played Indian, even assuming his on-screen persona in his daily life. Now, I'm not here this evening to discuss the dangers of stereotypes, but I am here this evening to discuss indigenous activism in what I refer to as the era of Standing Rock. And so in my talk this evening, I will detail the key characteristics of Native activism of this era, particularly as exhibited at Standing Rock. But more specifically, I will address our topic of the lecture series, Speaking Truth to Power, by examining Coast Salish people's activism against the farming of Atlantic salmon in their home waters, the Salish Sea. And the point I'm making here is that we do not need to look far to see examples of Native activism. I will then conclude with some more general thoughts on speaking truth to power and what Indigenous descent can teach us about this theme. Like the other protests detailed in earlier lectures in this series, Native activism in the era of Standing Rock has unique roots. specifically indigenous dissent against settler colonialism. Now, defined simply, settler colonialism is a form of colonialism through which indigenous peoples are removed and replaced by settlers from other places. Settler colonialism is rooted in the logic of elimination, whereby colonial nation-states eliminate native polities, cultures, and bodies, so as to make room for settlers and the livestock, other peoples, and the practices they bring with them. Yet, as we can see in this photo, this elimination remains incomplete. As I argue, settler colonialism unfolds across both indigenous homelands and waters. Scholars are just beginning to explore other dimensions of settler colonialism, specifically how this form of colonial expansion also seeks to eliminate native environments and the plants and animals on which tribal nations depend. And finally, theorists describe settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. This is really just a fancy way of saying what indigenous activists have long known all along, that settler colonialism continues today. It is not an artifact of the past. Settler colonialism sought to eliminate and continues to threaten native sovereignty and self-determination. Now, sovereignty is an imperfect yet useful word to describe the collection of practices in which indigenous peoples and polities engage in order to exercise self-determination today and to secure a future in which they can thrive. For indigenous peoples, sovereignty is lived every day. In the harvest, exchange, and consumption of traditional foods, in the telling of stories to pass on customary knowledge and histories, in the creation of sophisticated forms of art, in acknowledgments of indigenous lands and waters. And of course, there are iconic moments of native dissent against oppressive settler colonial nation states, and these too are expressions of sovereignty. Actions of native sovereignty insist on the recognition of inherent rights, often reserved by indigenous ancestors through treaties, to historical and place-based political affiliations. Which then brings me to one of the most important aspects of native activism in the era of Standing Rock. Many of these are over environmental issues. Now, indigenous peoples certainly have a range of unique relations with their homelands and waters. Now, just because I dismissed the stereotype of the ecological Indian does not mean that native relations to the environment do not exist. Nor are they some static and mystical expression of native affinity for the forests and its woodland creatures as Disney has taught generations of children. Instead, we should see these as specifically historical and political components of indigenous societies, both in the past and today. Now, I would like to draw your attention to this word, relations, that I keep using, because I am using it in a very precise way as it relates to indigenous sovereignty. Many indigenous peoples recognize varying degrees of relations to others, or relations that others define as kin-based or political, which, from a native perspective, overlap. Another important difference is that these relations encompass both the human and non-human world. And that's another distinction that is largely meaningless from an indigenous perspective. All right, so rather than continuing to speak in generalities, just wanted to set up a few concepts here. I'd like to get now to some specific examples. So let's examine the moments of indigenous activism that became known as the No DAPL movement that gave the era of Standing Rock its name. The rallying cry of No DAPL was Miniwachoni, water is life. It exemplifies the concepts of relationality, sovereignty, and self-determination, and the historical and contemporary context of settler colonialism that I just outlined. And Mini-Wachoni is more than a statement about the importance of water sustaining life. It also recognizes that the river itself is a living being and a relative of the Oceti-Sakowin. So when the indigenous water protectors at Standing Rock fought for the Minnesota, they were acting as any good relative would to protect one's relations. This expression of relationality, water is life, also illustrates the dimensions of sovereignty and self-determination that infuse Native activism. Water protectors' actions in 2016 and 2017 reflected pragmatic concerns, but in a political way. The Oceti-Sakowin sought to protect the relations they need in order to sustain a future in which they can thrive. And of course, a key part of the dissent at Standing Rock focused on the specious approach the Army Corps of Engineers took at consultation with this tribal nation. As Dave Archambault, then tribal chairman of Standing Rock, explained, they were completely left out of any consultation regarding the pipeline route until after the route was selected. Not uncommon, this lack of consultation was a clear violation of the principles of sovereignty and self-determination. And moreover, it seemed to indicate that the Corps knew that their actions were in direct violation of both treaty rights and principles of environmental justice. But none of this should come as a surprise. And this is where the context of Native dissent against historical and contemporary settler colonialism helps us see that the United States was nearly or has nearly always prioritized non-Native concerns over those of tribal nations, just as indigenous peoples have consistently fought back. Now, normally, this is a topic I unpack over 6 months in my 2-quarter survey on American Indian history. So I'll just speak really fast, and no, I won't inflict that. But relative to the situation along the Minnesota, I'm just going to focus on one earlier historical example to illustrate my point. The mid-20th century construction of dams throughout the homelands of the Oceti-Sakowin and other tribal nations. This began in the late 1930s as an ambitious and combined Army Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation's Pick-Sloan plan that would provide irrigation, navigation, and power production for farmers and cities and towns along the lower part of the Missouri River. The Bureau's plan called for 5 main stem dams along the Missouri, and it was no accident that each was sited at the edge of an Indian reservation. This meant that tribal nations along the upper Missouri would bear the greatest cost of this plan. For instance, the Garrison Dam, built at the edge of the Fort Berthold Reservation and completed in 1954, flooded 150,000 acres of prime agricultural land and every major community on the reservation. Over 80% of the reservation's residents needed to relocate to escape the reservoir's rising waters, which also destroyed schools, hospitals, and community centers. The Oahe Dam flooded native lands at the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River reservations, and the federal government saw this as yet another way to break tribal nations in the era of termination, a period of federal policy when Congress sought to terminate Indian treaties, reservations, and the unique status Native peoples have as tribal nations. In describing the effect that the Oahe Dam would have on tribes, one congressman in 1949 noted, when you take reservation land, you destroy not only the land that is taken, but you destroy the community life, religious, and civil life of the people. You destroy nations, as a matter of fact. The Bureau of Indian Affairs saw the outcome as beneficial because it would force these tribal nations to assimilate. Reservoirs would flood Indian communities, forcing them off their homelands upon which they relied and into a cash-based market economy. Completed in 1959 and opened in 1962, the Oahe Dam forced 170 families at Standing Rock to relocate. This dam has the singular distinction of having destroyed more Indian land, over 160,000 acres, than any single public works project in the United States. In both cases of the Garrison and Oahe dams, Native peoples spoke out against these public works projects that would benefit non-natives at the cost of tribal nations. For example, at the Fort Berthold Reservation, the affiliated Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa peoples mounted a decade-long effort of activism, fundraising, local political organizing, and national lobbying to fight the garrison. Minutes from the 55 district meetings the Tribal Council held across the reservation include numerous testimonies from families and individuals about the importance of the land and river. Many of these declarations also flamed a clear notion of tribal sovereignty and how the dam violated this. Now, the Fort Berthold dissent angered General Pick, who had designed the plan, and it fueled what seemed to be a personal grudge against the tribal nation. For instance, he prohibited them from harvesting the timber and oil resources that would be inundated. So much for progress. On October 1st of 1951, Garrison Dam was completed, and the tribal nation held a large, gut-wrenching goodbye to the valley event shortly before the waters flooded their homelands. The Oceti-Sakowin also protested against the dams. In 1958, Congress held a hearing about what the Oahe Dam would do to many Native communities. Numerous tribal members traveled to D.C. to attend and express their anger over what the federal government was doing. Louis Thief at Standing Rock compared the destruction the dam would cause to his people, to their homelands, and to related non-humans to the devastation unleashed by an atomic bomb. Former Standing Rock Sioux tribal chairwoman Josephine Kelly framed the theft of Indian land under the Pick-Sloan Plan as a breach of sovereignty. Those treaties are still valid today, she argued, and they were thrown in the wastebasket. But just the same, we were here first, but maybe we'll be here last. But the congressional hearing was not an actual process of consultation. See the pattern that's kind of unfolding here? It was simply an opportunity for Indians to share their feelings on record and for Congress to dictate what was already happening at the time, the completion of the dam by the Army Corps of Engineers. On January 1960, in the midst of a severe Dakota winter with temperatures falling as low as 30 degrees below zero, tribal families who lived within the Oahe Reservoir taking area were immediately forced to gather all their possessions and to leave their land, because the federal government had not yet made funds available for either the construction of new homes or the relocation of old dwellings. These people were crowded into cold and cheerless trailer houses, which they had to maintain at their own expense until permanent housing could be prepared. Now, I detail this history of Native removal from the northern plains because it's the context of settler colonialism that framed Indigenous activism at Standing Rock in 2016 and 2017. Moreover, as people at Standing Rock pointed out, once again, the Army Corps of Engineers were violating treaty protections, ignoring federally mandated consultation processes, and taking Indian lands. But we do not need to look far to find many other examples of Indigenous dissent in the era of Standing Rock. During the rest of my time this evening, I will speak about local Native activism, specifically that of Coast Salish and neighboring nations' efforts to combat Atlantic salmon farming in sovereign Indigenous marine space. Like the water protectors' activism at Standing Rock, what is unfolding in the waters of the Salish Sea and beyond exemplifies the concepts of relationality, sovereignty and self-determination, and the historical and contemporary context of settler colonialism. Now, for many of us in this room, the dangers of salmon farming perhaps didn't come to our attention until last August, when a net pen containing over 300,000 farmed Atlantic salmon collapsed off Cypress Island in the northwestern San Juan Islands. Around 200,000 invasive fish escaped into the Salish Sea. Cook Aquaculture, the company operating the fish farm, and 7 others in Washington waters, initially blamed the collapse on exceptionally high tides and currents coinciding with the solar eclipse. Guess they still had their little solar glasses on or something. But you know, the tides were not abnormally high when the nets collapsed. Cook seemed to know that this was a bogus excuse. Several weeks before the collapse of the net pen, they had done some emergency maintenance on the fish farm. State investigators instead have found that company negligence, specifically poor maintenance, caused the net pen collapse. Photos of the collapsed structure show them fouled with mussels. And these weren't just like, baby mussels. They were, around 6 to 9 months old. And the nets were fouled with kelp and algae also. In parts, it was so thick that you couldn't even see the nets. It was estimated that the nets were carrying an additional 110 tons of biofouling. Keeping the nets clean is critical. Not only do clogged nets make the water in the net pens really unhealthy, but they also increase the drag on the nets, making them heavier and putting more stress on the entire fish farm structure. But preventing this biofouling of the nets was kind of challenging for Cook Aquaculture to do because 2 of the 3 net cleaning machines happened to be out of service at the time. And the structure of the pen had suffered corrosion and metal fatigue. It was past the end of its useful life. And Cook knew it had problems with this particular net, but they had wanted to harvest the 305,000 Atlantic salmon before tackling the needed overhaul. You've got to make that profit. Even after the collapse, or the near collapse, in July, Cook took no steps that could have prevented the August disaster. It could have moved up the harvest, but it didn't. It chose to not replace the nets, add staff, or even station a nearby or a standby rescue tug. Both the company and the state lacked an adequate fish recovery plan. The slow, inadequate response allowed for invasive Atlantic salmon to infiltrate rivers across the Salish Sea. Tribal fishers have found them off Vancouver Island, as far west as Cape Flattery, down near Tacoma. Fishers of the Shisho Nation caught 3 of the escapees in Sabine Channel, 80 nautical miles from the Cook Spill. And 2 of the fish were females, full of eggs. The Skagit Nation fishers netted Atlantics 50 miles up the Skagit River, one of the state's few remaining premier wild salmon habitats. They found the free-swimming Atlantics to be healthy and very much alive, which contradicts an earlier state position that declared that any survivors were about to die from starvation. Response from tribal nations across the Salish Sea and beyond has been swift. Shortly after the collapse, the Lummi Nation declared a state of emergency. Cypress Island is in their ancestral waters. And Lummi's mobilized its fishing fleet to capture the escaped Atlantics, each fish weighing about 8 to 10 pounds. By the end of November, Lummi fishers had caught more than 400,000 pounds of the invasive fish. These native fishers bore the brunt of the cleanup effort and caught the most Atlantics. Now, Cook Aquaculture, which is responsible for cleaning up any spills or for adequately compensating those working to catch the escapees, initially offered the Lummies $30 a fish. Now, when the Lummi Indian Business Council responded that this didn't even cover their costs of the cleanup, Cook responded by offering $42 a fish but on the condition that the tribal nation would not push to phase out or ban net pen aquaculture. They also dangled the promise of exploring economic opportunities and partnerships that would bring an additional $1 million annually to the community. Tim Ballou II, chairman of the Business Council at the time, rejected the offer, noting that their demand to keep quiet for a few extra dollars was insulting. As he wrote, "To be perfectly clear, the Lummi Nation is not willing to be muzzled for an additional $12 a fish." Instead, the Lummies then led a charge to shut down net pen Atlantic salmon aquaculture in state waters, just as Cook Aquaculture had hustled to build up its fish farms in Puget Sound with permits granted by the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. And with investments of over $70 million in fish farms here in the state alone, Cook is eager to expand and upgrade its operations. Indigenous activism and dissent surrounding open water net pen fish farming in the Salish Sea exemplify a number of dynamics that we saw at Standing Rock. Coast Salish and neighboring indigenous peoples are taking a holistic view of the health and protection of their sovereign treaty waters. Lummi Tribal Chairman Jay Julius declared, "Something has to happen sooner with the breeding of invasive species in our waters. We can't afford to wait until the leases are up. The Salish Sea is at a tipping point." It was a garden so rich with fish and wildlife, the orcas were fat and fed well. It is hard to paint that picture because all we know is what we have now. And as with the Oceti-Sakowin's connection to the Minnesota, Coast Salish concerns about the health of the Salish Sea are rooted in relations with the water, and most importantly, salmon. These are exemplified in first salmon ceremonies that are still practiced today. Coast Salish peoples see salmon as kin, members of our extended communities. Yes, they fish for and consume salmon and sell the catch, but these actions are not defined in this extractive way. Instead, Coast Salish fishers understand that salmon give themselves for the greater health and well-being of the community. First salmon ceremonies express Coast Salish thanks and respect the gift provided by salmon. When done properly, these ceremonies ensure the continued return of salmon kin to the spawning grounds. The first salmon of the season in this ceremony is handled and prepared in a special way. The exact details differ from one community to the next, nor are they mine to share. Numerous protocols about who can come into contact with the first salmon and when kind of infuse this. Parts of the first salmon, for instance, are never discarded to dogs or sold or traded. And then, as you can see in this image, the bones of the first salmon are returned to the river, so it floats back out to the sea to tell its brothers and sisters of the respect it had received from the people. This ceremony ensures that the salmon are never wantonly wasted and that the runs are kept free and clean, or free from pollution and clean. So by protecting local waters, Coast Salish peoples are acting like any good relative. This is captured in the text of an open letter that 21 Washington tribes sent to state legislators 2 weeks ago. A healthy and productive Salish Sea is essential to our way of life and to our survival. We have harvested Pacific salmon, native salmon, since time immemorial, and we have an inherent right secured by treaty with the United States to continue to pursue our way of life of gathering, hunting, and harvesting natural resources. Along with this right comes a sacred obligation to protect our native salmon. And open water net pen farming of Atlantic salmon threatens the health of the Salish Sea. This type of aquaculture can create toxic algae blooms, only made worse by warming water temperatures. Atlantic salmon grown this way, that doesn't look appetizing, carry viruses and bacteria that threaten wild salmon stocks. And the real concern that escapees, especially in such large numbers, compete with native salmon for dwindling resources and spawning grounds, this coming precisely at the time that wild salmon stocks are threatened by other environmental concerns. These are real concerns. Last summer's net pen collapse off Cypress Island was neither the first nor the largest. Incidents in 1996, 1997, and 1999 resulted in the escape of nearly 600,000 Atlantic salmon. And then there's just like what they call local leakage, like low-level leakage of Atlantic salmon squirreling their ways out of these nets. Local native activism over salmon farming is just part of a larger constellation of other concerns that negatively impact the Salish Sea. This includes combating proposed coal trains and other pipelines that would bring polluting fossil fuels to our shores, along with an illegally permitted liquefied natural gas plant on the lands of the Puyallup Nation. Coast Salish activism to protect the water and salmon is not about trying to return to some past that is long lost. Instead, it is about ensuring that their tribal nations have a viable future in which they can thrive. For instance, in speaking up to convince Governor Inslee to ban salmon farming, Paul Chiokatin Wagner, Saanich founder of Protectors of the Salish Sea, describes the need to take bold action today for our children and grandchildren. This isn't grasping at the past, this is planning for the future. Also, like at Standing Rock, Native women have emerged as the vanguard caretakers of indigenous homelands and waters. Anybody catch this in the news? Several Native women erected teepees made from tarps, on the lawn of the state capitol earlier this month. For 4 days, they occupied the space outside the capitol, demanding respect of the treaties and restoration of the health of the Salish Sea. Specifically, they lobbied the state to deny further permits for the liquefied natural gas plant in Tacoma, to ban open water net pen salmon farming, and to more firmly oppose the Trans Mountain Pipeline terminus at the north end of the Salish Sea. Their activism inspired others, including Hanford McLeod, an Nisqually leader, to meet with the governor's office to present a copy of the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 to remind the state of its obligations to uphold the treaty rights of tribal nations. Like at Standing Rock, these Native women leaders see their actions as being symbolic of the indigenous matriarchy facing down the patriarchy of the settler colonial nation state. Similar to other moments of Native activism in the era of Standing Rock, the history of settler colonialism frames the context of this dissent. Lummi member Jewel Praying Wolf James highlights the way that settler colonialism has struck at the full spectrum of indigenous relations across the Salish Sea. There are fewer and fewer Puget Sound Chinook and Coho returning to the spawning habitat. It is open and available and becomes ripe for colonization, just like what happened to us. Already, we've seen a number of statements invoking the treaty rights of tribal nations and the need for the state to honor the treaties. These refer to the series of treaties that Native communities in Washington Territory negotiated and signed with Governor Isaac Stevens in 1854 and 1855. And in each of these treaties, indigenous leaders reserved for their people in perpetuity the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations. This right should not be understood in the limited extractive nature of fishing rights, and salmon is little more than commodities. Instead, we should consider it from the perspective of the worldview of Coast Salish and other neighboring peoples who signed these treaties. Most importantly, this right includes responsibilities to care for non-human relations. The Salmon people who give themselves to human communities and the waters of the Salish Sea. In the century following the treaties, non-native fishers and the local government worked to remove native peoples from their fisheries, just as the larger settler colonial nation-state eliminated indigenous communities from the land. And this unfolded in the Salish Sea with the expansion of cannery operations, fish traps, and increasingly expensive commercial fishing vessels. As we can see in these maps, and I'll show you a second one here in a moment, so take a close look at this. But as we can see in these maps of northern Puget Sound, fish traps received licenses from the state that allowed them to be built right on prime native fisheries. So what we have here is a map of native fisheries, kind of around the Bellingham area. And then here we've got a map of the fish traps, conveniently grafted right over the most productive native fisheries. As salmon stocks became overfished, the state passed laws that made native fishing methods and seasons illegal. As indigenous families fished in their usual and accustomed grounds, state fish and wildlife officers arrested Indian fishers and confiscated their gear. More commonly known as the fish wars of the 1960s and early 1970s, native activism exploded across the Salish Sea as tribal nations sought to exercise treaty fishing rights and garner support from the public for their dissent against the settler colonial policies that shut indigenous fishers out of ancestral waters. And as you can see, a militarized response to native activism is nothing new. These actions led to a string of court cases that eventually culminated in the 1974 Bolt decision, or U.S. v. Washington, in which Judge Bolt ruled that native negotiators had reserved for themselves and their descendants half the salmon. As you can see from this kind of homemade effigy, he wasn't very popular among some people. Now, while this is an important win, the Bolt decision, for the fishing industries of treaty tribes, what I want to draw your attention to is that the outcome of the Bolt decision enabled tribal nations to act once again as stewards of salmon in the Salish Sea. For example, in 1974, hot off the victory there in court, tribal authorities formed the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which has taken a lead role in implementing sustainable fisheries practices that align with indigenous values of respecting and caring for salmon. So the local native activism that we are seeing today in the era of Standing Rock is simply a part of a much longer history of indigenous efforts to reclaim our waters, whether it be through dam removals, restoration of a salmon fishery, or the tribal canoe journeys that continue to articulate a future of relations across the Salish Sea and beyond. There are many more points, both historical and contemporary, that I could discuss relative to local native activism in the era of Standing Rock, but I want to take the last few minutes of my time up here to reflect on the subject of tonight's lecture within the context of the larger topic of the lecture series. I am very honored to have been invited to speak in this series about speaking truth to power, protest and dissent in modern history. Pay attention to that word, modern. For one thing, the simple fact that the university's history department was eager to include American Indians as a people of modernity shows just how far our discipline has come in recent decades. Too many scholars seem content to only look at us in the safety of that past. Earlier lecture topics intersect in interesting ways with native activism. For those of you who have attended all the lectures, you probably thought I was like, who's that total jerk sitting down there texting on his phone? No, what I was doing was taking notes from everybody's talk that now I'm going to cherry pick from to draw together a few points. Previous speakers addressed the power and limits of nonviolent protest in colonial British India, the police state of Nazi Germany, and in the post-Arab Spring Middle East. For generations, Native activists have used nonviolent tactics to express their dissent against the policies and actions of the United States and the colonial regimes of the 17th and 18th centuries. In fact, I organized my entire Indian history survey around that theme. Yet Native dissent and the moments of Indigenous activism that it sparks emerge from a different historical and contemporary context, that of settler colonialism. This, along with Indigenous values rooted in relationality and sovereignty, help us see the connections across a longer history of Native efforts to speak truth to power than just those iconic events that seem to capture our attention in surprising ways each generation. So in conclusion, I would like to return to one particularly compelling statement from Professor Marhofer's lecture on protest in Nazi Germany. She noted, if popular protest was possible and even somewhat effective in a hyper-violent fascist police state, Nazi Germany, it must be far more effective in a democracy with a free public sphere. But even in a liberal democracy like that of the United States, specific limits to the effectiveness of dissent apply, most notably when the majority fail to support the dissenters because they feel that a particular issue is not their problem. So in considering what I have shared about Native activism in the era of Standing Rock, I ask a question of the audience. Where do you sit in supporting Indigenous efforts to use truth to challenge the oppressive structures of power? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Reid, for that wonderful talk. So you should have index cards that you got coming in, and if you could write your questions on those and pass those toward the internal aisles, we will collect those and go through them and ask a few questions up here. And I also want to note, while you're thinking of your questions, that after the Q&A, please stay put for about 2 minutes. Our chair, Anand Yang, who kicked off the series with his lecture on Gandhi, is going to come up and close the series with some closing, very, very brief closing remarks, including an announcement of next year's history lecture series subject. So that's your enticement. Please stay tuned. So while you're coming up with your questions, I'd like to use the fact that I have the microphone to start by asking a question of Professor Reid. You showed early in your talk this image of Maori activists standing in solidarity with the Standing Rock protests, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the possibilities of transnational solidarity in Indigenous activism.
Great, thank you. This was one of those points that I was like, boy, I really want to talk about this, but I'm running out of time. Back to that, I need 6 months to unpack this idea. If we think about what salmon do, they swim everywhere. Do you think they respect that 49th parallel, that little boundary line between Washington and British Columbia? Think about the term that I used repeatedly, probably too often, the Salish Sea. The whole reason that term exists is to recognize this larger region that is organized in a very different way than the political organization that we have between Canada and the United States. And so just like salmon are swimming across these permeable boundaries in the Salish Sea, Indigenous activism does the same thing. The Idle No More movement played a strong role at Standing Rock. One of the early slides that I showed as I transitioned to talking about local Native activism were some people up at Alert Bay, the northern part of Vancouver Island, who have occupied a number of fish farms. Okay, they're not actually related to, or they're neighbors of our Coast Salish peoples. But when they heard about, some of the dissents and protests that were being mounted here, they came down south of the border to act in solidarity with our Coast Salish peoples. And so what we see is that there's this large synergy, across this kind of global indigeneity that goes all the way down to Aotearoa, New Zealand, that goes to the Sami people up in the Arctic and Scandinavia, to Aboriginal Australians down there, to many different places where people are starting to combine their efforts, realizing that there's strength in power and strength in numbers. Tactics are being shared, ideas are being crossed across social media, things like that. So there's definitely that international component that figures strong in the era of Standing Rock.
Great. So we have a question here from the audience. The Bolt decision gives the tribes strong legal leverage in Puget Sound. So are there equivalent court cases in other states that can be used to provide legal leverage in other states?
Well, the way that the court system works is that, the Bolt decision, was in the federal courts, and the Supreme Court had the opportunity to adjudicate it, to overturn it, to support it, and they decided to uphold the Bolt decision. That makes it the supreme law of the land from a legal perspective. So, in all honesty, you don't need those other state decisions to be able to point to the Bolt decision as a successful legal route for tribal nations to use.
So another question we have here from the audience is, so often Native American or Indigenous peoples protests are steamrolled by the US government. What can be done to change this?
That little question I asked at the end? I think that and this is where, again, in the era of Standing Rock, utilizing the tools of technology and the opportunities that we have today, we can start to bypass, when we don't get the kind of attention that activists, would like to see, that we can get that message out, activists can get the message out, and can start to connect with larger audiences in a more kind of mainstream way. Most specifically, right now, the state legislature is considering a number of bills about what to do about these salmon farms in our waters. There's a bill that would close them down immediately. There's another bill that would phase them out gently over time until those leases expire in 2025. So are we going to wait for more of these spills and catastrophic open water net pen collapses? Or are people going to indicate their support for Indigenous activists? The choice is yours.
So I have 3 questions here that are basically asking the same thing. This is apparently a popular question. So to just put it all together, how can those of us who are not Indigenous to this continent most effectively support tribal nations' efforts to defend themselves and tribal rights?
It's a great question. I think one of the most important things to do is to listen. To listen to what Native peoples are saying, what their priorities and concerns are. I mean, this is part of what we teach our graduate students, that you can't just kind of helicopter, sometimes literally, into a Native community and extract your information and what you need. It's the same thing with even activism on behalf of Native peoples, but done by non-Natives. It should be done in engagement with tribal nations, with local communities. There are many, urban Indian activists here in Seattle. There are many organizations, along with, of course, all the tribal nations just here in the greater Salish Sea area. So one of the things that can be done is to listen to pay attention to, things like this letter written on behalf or written by the 21 tribes that are raising their objections and demanding that those salmon farms be closed immediately. So the information is out there. And what people need to do is follow up on this, make sure that their state legislators know that they're equally concerned about this, to support Native activists when they lead these lead these types of events. But most importantly, it's got to start with listening to, instead of just being kind of a voice for and co-opting that voice. So that would be kind of one approach that I would take with it.
Great. This is a related question, and I think it's a good one to end on, which is, what is the role of the university in educating the public on pressing issues such as Atlantic salmon farms and the building of a dangerous LNG plant on tribal lands?
Mm-hmm. You know, the University of Washington is a great place to take a range of classes for the students who are here in this room or the parents of students who are here that help our students think critically about these issues. We have a number of departments and colleges and, you know, kind of institutional units across campus that explore these opportunities. You can always sign up for my classes. You can sign up for a whole range of different classes that deal with environmental history, that deal with indigenous studies, that deal with many of the topics that we have touched upon across the entire sweep of the lecture series. That's one of the reasons why the department does this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Reid.
Thank you.
And I will turn the floor over to Anan Yang.
So I want to start out by echoing Josh's opening sentiment that all of us who get to speak in this lecture series consider it a great privilege, because one of the joys of participating in this series, whether as a speaker or as a member of the audience, is really to engage in a conversation with the incredible people that come here to the History Lecture Series this year and for the last 40-some years. So please give a shout out to all of you for being an incredible audience. And please join me in thanking the remarkable staff we have in the history department. Josh is here, Star Murray, Hannah, Wanjiko, and also the amazing staff of UWAA, and Betsy Brown is right here. And this is still very much of a germ of an idea, but we're thinking as a possible topic for next year, something along the lines of women rule, and then we're trying to figure out what is going to come after the colon. Basically, a series on women in power, and yes, there were women in power throughout many time periods in many places in the world. And what's up for sort of further discussion is whether we focus on royal histories of empresses and queens, in which case, hold on, because one of the constraints, there are 2 or 3 constraints in how we make our decisions. One is we don't bring onto the stage people that have just given talks recently, so that rules out a lot of people. The second is we try to vary the topics somewhat. So what we thought with this women rule one is looking at royal histories extending all the way from 1st century BCE, Cleopatra, to Queen Elizabeth I, to Catherine the Great, to the Empress Dowager, and then maybe ending with, because we can't come up with an example of a woman president in the United States, we would have to go with Eleanor Roosevelt or somebody like that. So that's one possibility, but it's still very much at the thinking stage. So we'll get back to you with a firm idea of what the next series is going to be. But thank you all for coming.